Okay, Cold War lecture, very, very long lecture, but I'll break it up into chunks. All right, and so we will just do an intro to what's going on in the Cold War. We'll get into this is maybe the most contentious part of the lecture. We will get into definitions of capitalism and socialism. This is a part of the lecture that I've actually added. Tried to not get into it in previous classes when I've taught it, but students have asked me to add this part. So I have added it. I will do my best to kind of, just deliver down the center, talk about the different ideas, talk about the evidence, the research. In this class, though, if you kind of disagree with anything in the lecture, I've often gotten papers that have kind of criticized the lectures. That's totally fine. I'm fine with that as long as you support with evidence and research. I don't really mind. We should have an open discussion of ideas, and the history is my belief. And there's lots of nuance here. I'll talk about foreign policy during the Cold War. We'll go to the end of the Cold War, and then we'll wrap up with by talking about Chile in specifically. You have some podcasts this week about Chile, and Chile is just kind of an interesting. Maybe I think it's more interesting to other people since I lived there for a while. But it's just kind of it's a microcosm of all these different things that we're going to cover through the lecture. Okay, and so broadly what happens is we have World War II. So World War II pits the Axis, primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan against the Allies, led by most prominently the U.S., the U.K., and the Soviet Union. After World War II, kind of the world splits into two camps. The NATO camp, which is, again, kind of represented by the U.S., or the U.S. is the main global power there. And then the Warsaw Pact, which is represented by the USSR, the Soviet Union. So these former allies kind of become enemies for most of the Cold War. The Cold War, maybe this is all obvious. Maybe you guys have heard this before, but just in case you haven't, I don't know what the level of knowledge is. And so it's called the Cold War essentially because both of these powers, the US and the Soviet Union, have atomic bombs. We saw the devastation that these atomic bombs can inflict at the end of World War II with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, both these powers, although they're diametrically opposed to one another, and essentially in this struggle, this global struggle, they are reluctant to make this war so-called hot, directly go at war with each other because they have atomic bombs and could essentially wipe out. They have enough atomic bombs to wipe out the other country, essentially kill almost everybody in the country, and then create, some sort of environmental disaster that would cause if you set off that many atomic bombs. So it's kind of the stalemate that happens, and that's why it's called the Cold War. And so it's, it's fought in other ways. Essentially, these other countries become kind of like proxy wars, shadow wars. It's fought a lot with the intelligence services, which we'll get into. Anyways, so we have, the blue here represented is the U.S. and the U.S.'s sphere of influence, or U.S. allies, and then the Soviets, and then the Soviet sphere of influence here in Eastern Europe. All right, and so really it is this clash of kind of different ideologies, both political and economic. And so in the West, we have liberal democracies. So we have democracies, essentially term limits, we have voting, freedom of speech. These sorts of things characterize the NATO countries. And their economies, by and large, are market economies. So economies based on markets, also called capitalism. This has become the word capitalism has become a very charged word. So I may use market economy throughout the lecture. Similar idea. We'll get into the specifics of what we mean. Market economy may be less charged. In the East, we have totalitarian states, essentially. One party, one dictator rule, suppressed speech, suppressed rights. That's politically how these countries are, primarily. And then we have Socialism, again, that word has also become very charged. So you could also think of these as a centrally planned economy, typically. Typically, the state is owning many of the major industries. So the state, the government, is controlling most of the economy directly. Whereas over here, the state has it certainly regulates the economy, but it doesn't directly own or set prices. So here, basically, what you have, a centrally planned economy, the government is owning most of the major industries, and they are setting quotas. Essentially, if they don't own it, they're setting, hey, this factory has to produce this amount of this good. They're setting prices, so they're saying things like bread will cost this much, and so there's a heavy hand or a heavy involvement in the economy. So we call that centrally planned or command and control economy. Okay? And that's different than socialism, but socialism often becomes the state running many of these major industries. Okay. All right, so we have these different political systems, which I've already kind of gotten into. In this one, this is the Soviet Union system. Many of the allies, essentially, they have either one ruler or one party is in charge, with a lack of many basic freedoms: freedom of the press, freedom of speech. Okay, take a break there before we get into some fun stuff.